listeners, and welcome back to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. You're here for another SKYLIT author interview. I'm your host for this episode, Justin Remer, and I'm so excited today to have with us novelist, memoirist, professor Nick Brown, who has written a new book in the 33 1/3 series on the debut album from Violent Femmes, the self-titled Violent Femmes. Thanks for being with us, Nick.
I am very excited to be here, Justin. Thank you for having me.
And we talked a little bit before that you wanted to read an excerpt from the very beginning of the book, just sort of set the tone. So go right ahead.
Okay, this is the prologue of my book. It's called The Organist. You know the song, but you can't place it. Maybe it's because you're inside of a baseball stadium. It isn't a setting in which you often think about music. Or maybe it's because the melody in question is being played by an organist. Or because it's hot and you're in direct sun. Whatever the problem is, you can't figure it out, but then you don't have a chance to think much more about it, because almost as soon as the melody has started, after just 16 staccato notes over 3 short measures, it ends. At which point, every human in the stadium claps 2 short bursts of double 16th notes in response. All day long, the guy on the organ has been cranking out the classics. If You're Happy and You Know It, the Mexican hand-clapping song, Take Me Out to the Ball Game, Charge. None of these songs has made you think about much of anything. They're just empty signals to cheer. But this one, the song the organist has just started up again, it conjures a distinctly different feeling for you. Something more potent and strange, something personal, something deep and nostalgic and formative. Something important, something that has something to do with art. There it is. It's coming back to you now, at first as an image. You see a glowing doorway. You're 11 years old, standing before it. It's 1988. You're at Doug Starr's house after school, and there is a melody issuing forth from that doorway of light. You've been drawn to the sound like some hypnotized preteen moth to the flame. And it's the same song you're hearing right now. Only in your memory, it isn't being played by an organist. No, it's being performed on some type of guitar that sounds like it's getting pecked at by an angry bird. And there's a young man singing above that guitar in a thin, high voice, dancing just along the edge of breaking. It's all issuing forth from a small boombox on the top of a dresser. And then you realize you're looking into Doug's older sister's bedroom, because suddenly there she is. Maybe 16 years old, pulling a sweater from a drawer. She's bent over, and her blonde hair is hanging like a curtain into a sunbeam. It glows in that light, perhaps even brighter than the sun itself. And the song, you realize, as you listen closely, is even about the sun. It's about a blister in the sun. What is this, you say? Doug's sister looks up. Somehow she understands you're asking about the music, even though you haven't said as much. The power of the song makes the point moot. It's the Violent Femmes, she says. Back in the stadium, you point to the air. It's the Violent Femmes, you say. Oh yeah, your wife says. Weird. It is weird. How did this happen? How did this song, Blister in the Sun, the opening track off the acoustic post-punk band's self-titled 1983 debut, manage to enter the American lexicon of sporting anthems? Okay, I'll stop there.
Great. I love it because I agree. It is one of the, you talk a little bit too later about like the Ramones, Hey Ho, Let's Go. And it's like, wow, how did this go from being, the edge to just sort of like everyone at a sports game knows do clap, 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 clap.
Totally. There's that really weird subset of the Ramones, the Violent Femmes. There's like 7 Nations Army or whatever, but like especially the Ramones and the Violent Femmes becoming like part of the repertoire of like a baseball organist. Just there's something big about like our lives in the like cultural framing of the country that is encapsulated there. I mean, it's mostly about the passage of time, really, but it's just. Yeah, it's always amazing for me to hear that.
Well, it's interesting, too, because you mentioned maybe even in that prologue, I wasn't aware of how much of a slow burn this album was like commercially. Like
totally.
That it got to be platinum, but it took like a decade essentially to get there.
Yeah. So I'm 49, right? I got into this record. I heard it in 1988. Maybe 89 or 90 was when I was really soaking up every note of it. And for a lot of people who encountered this record, it was on a dubbed cassette tape without cover art, without even like a list of songs or anything. And so it we didn't really know when it came out. The name of the album is the name of the band too, and I didn't know what the guys looked like. I didn't know the title. And so for me, and I think a lot of people, it just seemed like a record that came out around 1988 or 89. And it actually came out in 1983, and it had what I call, well, it was like it went viral via cassette over 8 years, because it came out in 83 and is just like the slowest burn until it finally reached the bottom of the Billboard 200 in 1991, at which point it had already gone gold and platinum. So it went platinum before it even touched the bottom of the Billboard 200. Wow. And so, yeah, it has been said it's the only album to ever have that trajectory. I couldn't find the official, data to support that, but they're not a lot that follow that path.
No, certainly not. It's interesting too that you talk about not knowing what the band looks like, because did they do any videos for this first album?
So they did a video for Gone Daddy Gone. Okay. Which was the single off this album. Most people think the single was Blister in the Sun. That was never a single. So they did do a video, and it's great looking. And it did get play, but, for whatever reason, I think it was like 120 minutes. It was late. I was younger. I don't remember really the video being important to me experiencing the record. I had no idea what these guys looked like. Yeah. At all. And in fact, I had a friend tell me that just yesterday. She said, I looked at a photo of the Violent Femmes and I realized just now I never knew what any of these guys looked like. And I was like, you're not alone.
Yeah.
It couldn't happen today, right? Like, it seems almost insane to like imagine having a record be important to us and us not knowing what the members looked like or really anything about them.
Yeah, and even just you saying that like Blister in the Sun was not a single, because it's like, that feels like the signature song of the album, of the band, of everything, and it just sort of organically became that because it was just undeniable.
That's right. Brian Ritchie, the bass player, likes to say that Violent Femmes, they don't have hits. They don't have hits. They have classics, and. He's right. We think of, and so many of the songs on this record are sort of cultural hits. That's what their manager, Jeff Casselaz, calls it. A cultural hit that's sort of become more pervasive in the fabric of culture, as opposed to something that just runs up the charts for a couple weeks. And so, these songs never hit. The album hit the Billboard 200, but none of these songs hit the Billboard, Hot 100 or anything. So, yeah, they were hits at our parties on cassettes right. in weird dorm rooms and basements,
Yeah. Well, actually, maybe we should talk a little bit about the band, because also one of the things that I learned from your book that was really interesting was that the name sort of preceded them coming together as a unit. So if you could talk a little about the formation of the band and that stuff.
Sure. As with so many aspects of this band, like what you expect is a little bit off, And so the name Violent Femmes was actually a name for the rhythm section. The band is a trio. They play very unusual instruments, mostly geared towards busking on a street corner. It's sort of like a jug band instruments, really, which we can get into. But Brian Ritchie and Victor DiLorenzo, the bassist and drummer, had been playing for a while in Milwaukee. And they're both technically excellent at their instruments. And at the time, were sort of in demand as sidemen. And so Brian Ritchie had the idea to give their rhythm section the name The Violent Femmes. And like in the vernacular of Milwaukee at the time, a femme, was basically like, an art guy who wasn't good at sports, who got bullied or something,
Right.
So like it's like a sissy or something, and so he loved the idea of this of femme being furious, and so he thought it was hilarious, and that's how those two came up with the name. Then they met Gordon, the singer, and for a little bit they were Gordon Gano and the Violent Femmes, and then Gordon's name fell away and the identity sort of firmed up.
And it's interesting too. This maybe even ties back into the not knowing what they look like. Despite how sort of like raw the album sounds, it does sort of sound normal.
Yep.
But like they're not. But they're not playing the instruments that they should be. In quotes, should be playing.
Totally. That's a perfect description of it, because you can be an 8th grader or a 5th grader and listen to the record and think, this sounds awesome. I just love listening to this. Or you can be a really sophisticated, musical listener and listen to it and also think like, this sounds awesome. It's a little like, there's something a little different here. But, the songs themselves are so well crafted, so hooky, that they sort of like beguile you into not noticing the strange presentation. And what I'm getting at is the band's instrumentation is guitar, acoustic bass. And when I say acoustic bass, most people envision like a stand-up bass like you'd see in a jazz combo. This is an acoustic bass guitar that's sort of like what you would see in a mariachi band. And then a drummer who's playing a snare drum standing up with brushes. And then he also has a metal bushel basket turned upside down on top of a floor tom. And that's the whole thing. And so it's sort of amazing the amount of sound they can get out of these 3 acoustic instruments. They like to think about the way the album sounds outside of time for really when it was recorded or any period, because the way it was recorded in the instruments means it could have been made in 1983, it could have been made in 1953, it could have been made today. And so it does and the production is it's essentially a live recording, so that, the production doesn't have a stylistic imprint on it. So it really is a timeless album in a sort of technical way too, It comes back to us saying like a lot of people don't know when it came out because it's, it doesn't sound like a 1983 record with the heavy gated drums and, silly production and stuff. So it's unique.
Yeah, I love that quote that you have from Gordon Gano where like someone says like, this is such a quintessentially 90s album. And he's like, well, we made it in the 80s, but okay. Like,
yeah. I mean, the things he hears, you can only imagine like hearing the crazy stuff from fans that Gordon gets. But yeah, so the record came out in 83, but even more surprising is that Gordon wrote all the songs, or most of them, well beforehand, or, he was 19 when the record came out. So like some of these songs were written in the 70s, that the closer, Good Feeling, was written when he was 15 in 1978. And he says you can tell it was written in 78 because he refers to a woman in the song as lady. And I've been thinking about that, right? I'm like, oh yeah, that was a thing, like lady. Dear lady, and I'm like, oh yeah, that is that. Not a lot of people are singing to their lady now.
Yeah. I love the part too where you have him talking about in Blister in the Sun how he was like, how do I talk about knowing that someone's the one and figuring like, well, it won't be their eyes or their hair or something. Big hands. That'll be the thing that proves they're the one. Yeah.
That's right. He's a really good writer, right? Which is part of the reason that these songs have lasted so long, because they're really singular. He's super vulnerable. The lines pop. But part of that is he is always endeavoring to avoid cliche. So yes, in Blister in the Sun, when he's imagining his dream, lady, he doesn't want to say, yeah, she's got blue eyes or blonde hair, she's dainty or petite. He was trying to come up with a description that would be unlike any of that. So yeah, big hands.
So I was curious because I don't know if we have so many regular listeners, but regular listeners of this podcast know that I pitched a 33 and a third. It's getting made. It's coming out later this year,
which is awesome. Congrats.
Thank you. But I'm curious, like in the pitching process, how certain were you that you were going to be able to interview the band for your book? Because I feel like that's a really key component of the finished book. And
Yeah.
was that something you knew you could get?
Yeah, and that was part of the pitch, and also what I feel like makes this sort of special, because it essentially all of the content in this book is based on interviews I did over the last 2 years, with the band members. So it's very current, and so there's new stuff in that way too. But when the album was approaching its 40th anniversary, their management actually reached out to me about doing essentially like a liner notes or a book or a project with them for the 40th anniversary. They were familiar with my work, and in my memoir, which had come out, I think right around then, I'd mentioned the Violent Femmes. And so they reached out, and I was like, well, yeah, I mean, I'd love to do that. Now's not the right time. It didn't fit for the album, and they got David Frick to do the liner notes, which is like, it's better than me anyway. But
Sure.
But it did put that thing in my head. I was like, but I'm sure like you, I've always wanted to do a 33 and a third book, And this has always been one of those records where I knew like I wouldn't have to do any deep listening. Like I have every note, memorized, right? It's like the easiest one to approach. And so I was like, man, well, I've been thinking about doing a 33 and a third. If I pitched it, would the guys work with me? And they were like, oh yeah, for sure. So that was baked into my pitch. That's why it was a special project, right? It was like management, the band, they're all on board. We can make this happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was lucky.
And it's so great because not only do you sort of get that behind the scenes stuff, but there are little moments where like their responses are sort of building on each other. So it's nice to get all three of them there. And also, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the producer's name, but also his take as well. And yeah,
right, Mark Van Hecke. Yeah, that was amazing to find him. I mean, obviously, like all of us, we're not getting younger, although I'm trying to. It's not working, but. He's older than the guys in the band, and it was a bit of a trick hunting everybody down. But you're right, all the stories build on each other, and bands that have been together for a long time, of course, have like it's just like a marriage, or more complicated in a lot of ways, and. Some of the different factions hadn't spoken to each other in a long time, and I was the one speaking to them individually. It's not like I got them all in the same room. And like across the board, they all just had the best things to say about each other. It was really, I was sort of like, am I gonna host Thanksgiving this year? Like, am I the one bringing everybody back together? But yeah, it was cool. Their stories built on top of each other. They talked to each other, but it was like, this album is a special moment in culture, but in particular for the lives of everybody involved. And so it's also, I think, a wonderful thing for them to talk about because, the band members knew it was great at the time, but still, everybody is a little bit incredulous about the path this record took to success. And so I think they enjoyed talking about it in that sort of way, like there was a sweet spot.
Yeah, you can really feel it in the book. Like, because there can be so many approaches to albums in the 33 and a third series, it's almost like I don't know what I want, but I know what I don't want.
Yeah.
There's none of that in your book, fortunately. So
I know just what you mean. And like that is sort of what's great about the 33 and a third series is the variety of approaches, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I will say like mine there like is pretty straight ahead, and it's like let's just sit down with the band and dig into every part of this in a somewhat linear, sequence. But nobody had done it before that way, And so I joke, quoting Violent Femmes song that this is the book's permanent record, Yeah. That's of course from the classic line from Add It Up where Gordon sings, I hope you know this will go down on your permanent record.
Of course.
Yes.
But it's nice too because, you fold in a little bit of memoir, like kind of like the right amount. I'm not going to name names, but like there are definitely some books where it's like I really care more about the album than you, dude. But like, but it's also nice to know the writer's stake in the album. So I feel like you nailed the right amount of memoir to go along with everything else.
Well, thank you. I mean, that prologue that I read is really, that's about the depth of the memoir aspect, really is that opening thing. But I did want to frame it with, why is this important to me? And also, especially with that part that I read, sort of like maybe explaining to some people who don't know the Violent Femmes, like, you actually do know them. You hear this
Right.
like this melody from one of their songs all the time. You won't believe the story I have to tell. But you're right. I didn't want to get this sort of bogged down in memoir, but at the same time, the album has been an important part of my life, and I'm a musician too, and have strangely shared the stage with the Femmes, at least once that I remember, and so my life weaves a little bit in and out, but this is mostly the story of the album.
Nice. You do also have that moment where you're talking to Gordon about Promise, and you say that an involuntary grunt comes out because he sort of says like, well, this is one of the ones that nobody really likes. And you're kind of like,
but that's 100% true. I couldn't, he promised into the kill. He was like, well, these are the ones that maybe aren't the most classic of these classic. And when he said it, I really was like, oh, like I couldn't wrap my head around thinking any parts of this record would be less beloved than others. And there were really two things that I realized at that point. One is really that I don't think of this album as a sequence of songs. I really do think of it as like one long song. I still get the songs a little mixed up. I'll think of the bridge of Add It Up, sort of overlapping with Kiss Off, and they all, And so when he said that, it was weird for me to think like people had favorite songs on the record. But then what it really revealed was like, oh, I'm still an 11-year-old fan, It's like
right.
The most biased writer. I'm their dream writer for this, because I'm just like, oh, it's so good. But yeah, was a moment of lifting the veil on myself a little bit.
Yeah. Was there any aspect of your original conception that didn't stick around that you wound up being like, there's not room for it, I got to get rid of that part or something like that?
Yeah, I wanted to have a listening party with my daughter's friends. My daughter's 17 right now. When I pitched the book, she was like 15 or so, it wasn't that long ago. But I was curious to see like how her generation sort of interacted with the material. And for a variety of reasons that didn't really pan out, but also like that it was, a lot of them already know the material, like I just saw one of her friends posted something on Instagram yesterday. It was like her and her boyfriend with a clip of Good Feeling. And I'm like, oh my God, they already know the record. And I didn't have room for it, but that was one thing I was interested in, is just like, how does this fit with a generation of listeners that are at the same age that I was when I first heard it.
Yeah. I mean, totally kind of fascinating, but also like you can see where, just didn't end up fitting in the end.
No.
You talk a bit about, because you are a musician, you talk a bit about how the band's arrangements are not what most rock bands do, and that Gordon, as the sort of rhythm guitarist, like lays back and is kind of like not sort of driving the song so much as the bass is, which reminds me a little bit of, because I play guitar a bit. I had a band for a bit, and I wanted to cover some Elvis Costello, and I realized that for the guitar it kind of sucks because it's really the bass and keyboard that's really doing those Elvis Costello and the Attractions. It's really Attractions that are driving those songs.
Right. And I didn't understand this at all when I was first listening to the album, But the main melodic instrument is really Brian Ritchie's acoustic bass guitar. Yeah. And, he says that it's because, Gordon was a less advanced musician than Brian or Victor when these songs are being written. He's good at rhythm guitar, but that was really sort of it. And then Victor's playing such a stripped down drum. You can't even really say set. The drum approach
Right.
is so stripped down that there's just tons of room. And so it leaves this space for the bass guitar to be making these melodic statements. And on top of that, the fact that it's an acoustic bass guitar means that like the melodies and the solos that you hear, it's sort of like, is that even bass guitar? What am I hearing? But my friend Shannon Ferguson, who's a guitarist and a bass player, and he's probably best known for his work with the band Longwave. He, like me, grew up being in love with this record, and he's the one who's like, that album's all lead bass. And I was like, oh, I love that phrase. And so I still didn't believe it. I was like, am I tricking myself into thinking this? And so I finally asked Brian Ritchie, like, is this album all lead bass? And he said something along the lines of, it's the most bass forward album ever in the history of popular music. But, and that might be hyperbole, but really like not that far. So that is a real unique instrumental approach. But coming back to what we were talking about earlier, it doesn't sound that crazy. It makes sense organically because of the instrumentation and their approach to the material. And part of that is because they worked these songs up busking on street corners, an unforgiving sonic landscape, right? They just made it work however they could, and that's how it worked.
Yeah, I like the part where you were talking about how even in the rare moments where Gordon takes a solo, he's usually playing chords because he was trying to cut through the noise on the street.
Yeah, he talks about, the first few times he tried to take a solo on the sidewalk and playing individual notes, they just get lost. And so he started this thing, and you hear it on the solos where he's, playing a sequence of chords, really, just because that's what cuts through. It's a unique approach. But, I mean, really, it comes back to when they went into the studio, they'd played these songs that way so many times that they really just played them live, they just knocked them out. And they have a lot of improvisation built into them too. But they were, for people who hadn't had a lot of real gigs, they were sort of seasoned pros for some young, weird, art freaks coming into the studio at the time. They had their act down.
It's interesting too, because I re-listened to the album yesterday, sort of intermittently with reading your book. And it's funny not doing a close listen, just being like, yeah, I get this kind of like ragged energy. But then when you give it a close listen, you're like, oh, some of this is like sloppy.
Oh,
and they just kind of kept the take because like that's the energy. That's the
totally.
So it's the kind of thing where you're like, yeah, they had to have played this live because this is not to a click. This is absolutely not to a click track.
Not to a click. And, the thing that you might hear the most like sloppiness around, maybe some of the intonation on the vocals, and even that, like they talk about just sort of how great it is that it just sounds real. There's trying to capture the energy as opposed to perfection. But also, it's that thing where like some of the sloppiness doesn't undercut the quality of the musicianship, like,
Not at all.
I mean,
Not
yeah,
at
right.
all, yeah.
Because like, especially Brian and Victor were very sophisticated musicians when they were playing this. Of course, Gordon was an incredibly talented songwriter, and his instrumental approach was very sophisticated in a way, and how it allowed space for those other unique elements to come to the surface. But, Victor and Brian's playing is just like, just spectacular.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's very, the sloppiness or whatever you want to call it. It feels very emotional. It doesn't feel like these guys didn't practice or whatever or something.
Yes, exactly. Right.
I like the little section you were talking about, the Gnarls Barkley Gone Daddy Gone cover, and how it can't quite get it because, well, talk a little bit about that.
So Victor's drumming approach, as I discussed, is really just playing brushes on the snare drum, which means he's playing half of what the traditional rock and roll, backbeat is really, So we're used to hearing 1 and 3 on the kick drum, 2 and 4 on the snare, right? In various permutations, right? He doesn't have a kick drum. And so the acoustic bass guitar has all that space to sort of play the kick drum notes, and he's just really hitting the 2 and 4. Now, like, I'm a drummer, so when I was a kid, I would put the record on, and I would play drum set parts. I was creating drum set parts that didn't exist because the songs were suggesting them, right? But Victor, the drummer, points out that, when you have this sort of fractured approach, it creates a little bit more artistic magic around the song. And when you take that away, it does the inverse too. And so for me, listening to the Gnarls Barkley cover, where the drum track is essentially the same as like the rock beat on a Casio, it's, there's so much less sort of like mystical, sort of magic in the rhythm part. It's a really good example of what they were doing without a lot of us really even understanding what they were doing.
And also that song is so fascinating for the xylophone on it as well.
Man, again, like Brian Ritchie having some of the most well-known popular music-based melodic statements, that's one of the most prominent mallet parts in popular music too, which is this solo on Gone Daddy Gone, which he plays on the xylophone. Actually, on the recording, it's what's called a xylorimba, which is... Okay. It's a combination of a marimba and a xylophone, but he wrote it on a xylophone, which he found on the street. And the part arose, I love this. When they were busking, they made this realization that they would get more money from tips if the drummer wasn't with them, because he was a little bit older than the other two guys and a little more put together looking. And so when Victor was with them, they wouldn't get that many tips. They would get a little bit more when it was just Gordon and Brian. And so they went out as a duo one day to make some more money. And Brian had found this xylophone and just decided to whip up a xylophone part at the time, which he did. And it stuck with him. It's clearly a great part. But that was a challenge in the studio because everything else was tracked to 8-track, basically, without overdubs. And he couldn't play the xylophone and bass at the same time. So Gone Daddy Gone and the last song were both what they call their big production numbers because they had 3 or 4 overdubs on them. But yeah, that xylophone part, man, that xylophone part is so great. That solo is so great.
Yeah, totally. And you talk about how it's hard to even think of what would be number 2 on that list. But I do want to propose you should check out a band from New Jersey that I've known in my life called Crazy in the Brains. And I don't think they have a xylophone player anymore, but on their first couple records they did. And they have a song called Brain Freeze that has a very, it's not going to beat Gone Daddy Gone, but it has a very nice xylophone part. So
I love it. I don't need to be convinced. My dream band, I've always wanted to be in a band where it's drums, bass, and vibes.
Nice.
That's it, right? I was in a band with a sort of vibes prodigy when I was in middle school, and I was like, man, that is the coolest. I'm not sure anybody would come to our shows, but for me, I would be excited. Okay, cool. That's a great tip.
Yeah. Actually, it's funny that you say that. There is a part of me that sometimes just does enjoy vibes, and I'll be like, yeah, put on some Milt Jackson, or I think I'm trying to remember the title of it, but I discovered an album that was called Guys and Dolls Like Vibes, and it was just all covers of that musical. Sorry, spit take.
This coming from the guy who wrote the book on Weird Al. I love that you have the Guys and Dolls Vibes album.
Yeah,
that's great.
It's pretty darn good. Sort of tying in a little bit to what you were just saying, there's a quote, I had to nail it down, but I wrote the page down. I want to read it exactly because I think you really nail what's great about the sound of the first album. Together, the 3 musicians often sound more like one instrument on this album than a band of them. Mm-hmm. And I think that nails it. I think that's exactly what this album sounds like.
Well, I made that realization when, is what I was talking about earlier, when Brian pointed out to me that his bass guitar parts often, he's playing the bass drum part that we might expect in a more conventional, um, you know, song or arrangement. And I was like, oh my gosh, the bass guitar and the snare drum together are a drum set while also being two instruments. And then, the rhythm guitar itself is a lot of times really just sort of hitting that 2 and 4 downbeat in a way that enhances the brushes. So it makes it, it's all like one instrument, which of course is what great bands do. But because they're so minimal and stripped down, you can sort of see like the edges and the rivets and the folds and the way it's put together a little bit more easily, I guess.
Yeah. I was interested too, at what point did you decide because talking about the instruments, I'm thinking of the illustrations of the instruments that are in the book. At what point did you decide your book should have hand illustrations in it?
Well, I'm glad you asked because I love the illustrations in my book. That's a student of mine, Casey. She's a student.
Oh.
I teach at Clemson University, and she's not an art student. She's not a creative writing student. She studies turtles in the Clemson forest, but she took a screenwriting class with me, and she would turn in these incredible drawings on her screenplays. They were so cool. And so for my last book, I hired her to do tour posters for my book tour, and they were just the coolest. And so then when I started writing this book, I was writing about the instruments. And as we mentioned, I think it's hard for people to understand how unique the instruments are without seeing them, even if I describe them. So I thought, man, I need to have illustrations. And so I called Casey and I was like, hey, you want to do some illustrations for this? She turned in the illustrations of the instruments, and they were just so great that I was like, oh, you got to do one for each chapter. And so she picked just sort of a random specific image from each chapter, which sort of doesn't make sense. At the beginning of the chapter, you have to read the chapter to figure out why that image, sort of fits in. So that was just a total organic thing that happened with, me encountering this artist in Clemson, South Carolina. She's amazing.
Yeah, they're so good. The chapter about the band forming that starts with the National Honor Society pin image. I was like, oh, I remember those pins. And I like the backstory of that pin too. Actually, can you tell that story real quick?
Yes, yeah, of course. So one of Gordon's first gigs that he'd played that was really on a stage was he got booked to open for Jonathan Richman, and the theater owner had given Brian Ritchie a tip that he should go hear this opener for Brian Richmond, Gordon. And so Brian went to hear Gordon. That's the first time he'd ever heard Gordon play. And maybe the same week or, very soon thereafter, maybe even a few days after, they were at this punk club together in Milwaukee and ran into each other. And Brian Ritchie, was basically like, I really enjoyed hearing you play. And Gordon said, well, hey, I have a gig in the morning playing at my high school for my National Honor Society initiation ceremony. Do you want to come play it with me? And at this point, Gordon was in high school. He was 17. Brian was 20. At which, those are big years at that point. Living in his own apartment, he was a working musician, but still, he was like, "Yeah, I'll go to high school with you." So, and this wasn't in the book, but Gordon's dad came over and picked up Brian. Brian didn't have a driver's license, so
oh, nice.
Gordon's dad rolls up in this huge, I don't know what the car was. I imagine some giant Buick sedan or something. They drive to the high school and. Apparently for this initiation society, they would have, it was like a talent show of honor students who, would sort of do their things. And Gordon was going to play a song. So he went up there with Brian and they started playing the song Good Friend, which is a nice mid-tempo number about friendship. It actually showed up on the Violent Femmes third album. And then I think they probably sensed it was a little dead in the room. So he quickly switched to the song Give Me the Car, which is about a young man wanting his dad to loan him the car so he can take a date out and they can drink a bunch and do a lot of drugs and make out in the car. And they started playing this song. And as Brian says, they basically almost started a riot. The crowd went insane. I mean, it's like a scene from a John Hughes film, right? Like the crowd's going crazy. You know, the guys are singing their slightly, you know, edgy lyrics, and the principal's on the side of the stage telling them to stop, and they did not stop. And so Gordon fled the premises. We could not return to school unless he met with the principal, with his parents, and the National Honor Society did not induct him. He had gotten his pin, though, and they sent him a letter from D.C., from the actual office, demanding the return of their property, which he never could find the pin to send back to him. So, I mean, like, how is that even true, right? I mean, it's an incredible story, but apparently true.
And I love that you said like a John Hughes movie, because like when I was reading it, that's the vibe. I was just like, oh, they did the like,
right? I mean, that's like, that was
riling up the school assembly. Oh yeah,
and the bad guy principal going, "Stop! You can't do this." Yeah, classic. So that was the first time Brian and Gordon played together, and then Victor was out of town for a while because he was an actor in an experimental theater group at the time. So by the time he got back, Brian and Gordon had already sort of had their thing together, and Victor plugged in, and then that's how, you know, the rest is history.
Yeah. There's a big chunk of the book where you break down the album song by song. Mm-hmm. When you were doing that, were there any stories that really caught you by surprise, or is this the kind of thing like you've known this album for decades and like you're just sort of collating the official story?
Right. No, a lot of the stories took me by surprise. And that's sort of like why it plays out in that way. You know, I didn't exactly plan to just go through song by song in sequence with a short chapter about each one. But once I did the interviews, I sort of realized like, oh my, like each song really has at least one great little anecdote in there. And some of them have like 3 anecdotes that are like, I can't believe this, you know?
Right.
And so I was like, I don't have to overthink this. I'm just going through song by song. So, for example, we'll talk about Blister in the Sun, which is probably the best known, you know, song on this record.
Sure.
Gordon doesn't really know the lyrics is one of the amazing takeaways here.
100%. That's the part that like pleased and surprised me. Yeah.
Yes. So he has this, what he calls a condition, where he switches up in his mind. The vowels A and I are sort of like, you know, synonymous. They can be one or the other, and he can't remember when he writes them down which one it is. And so it applies to this song because the chorus, he says, well, it sounds like a blister in the sun. But he says in his mind, it's also sometimes like I blister in the sun. And so he's telling me this, and he's like, I can't remember how I sang it last night. And he said, what do you think it is? And I'm like, I can't believe he's asking me what the lyrics to his most famous song are. And so, you know, a blister in the sun is what he says in the end. Like, I think that's really sort of what it is most of the time. But, you know, it's interesting. I have in my hand right here the liner notes for the 40th anniversary
nice.
vinyl reissue.
Yeah, I can see the vinyl right there.
Right. And they got for the inner sleeve, they got Gordon to handwrite all the lyrics. And so this is recent. And I looked at it the other day to see what he'd written, and he says, like I blister in the sun here. Wow. And so it really is sort of like one or the other. So that was a great anecdote, realizing like, you know, he jokes about how many people sing the wrong lyrics to that song. And the funny part is like, well, are there actually right lyrics, considering he doesn't really know either. And then of course there's the whole assumption, which was culturally ubiquitous, that song is about masturbation, because there are lines about like my body beats, stained sheets, big hands, right? And that was absolutely not Gordon's intention in writing the song. And he's got a great anecdote about the song having been out for like 8 or 9 years, and a friend musician talking to him about that meaning of the song, and him realizing like, wait, everybody else in the world thinks this and I've never even heard this. And so that cracked me up too.
Yeah. And it is interesting because, as a like a young listener, for sure I had the, wait, is he saying a blister in the sun? Is he saying I blister in the sun? And then thinking about the meanings of that.
Yep.
And I had always assumed it was I, because it's like, yes, this is a song about a hermit. He never wants to leave. He wants to stay inside.
Right.
He goes on like he blisters in the sun. And also, like, I like that where you admit, you're like, I always thought it was like, let me go wild instead of let me go on.
Yep.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that, especially as you're saying, when you have just a cassette tape with no other roadmap, you're just like, I'm doing the best I can.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember I thought they were French for a little bit because they had FEMMES in the name. I'm like, are these guys from France? Like, how? I am cultured. But, Gordon also speaks pretty eloquently about how that's part of the attraction of that song, too. It's sort of like haiku-like mystery. Like, what is this about? Which is also unusual for his songwriting. If you think about the rest of the songs on this album in particular, most of the rest of the songs are really like dramatic monologues, very theatrical, very literary. They're sort of telling stories. But Blister in the Sun is a very compressed lyrical mystery.
Yeah. When you talk about how, I don't know if it was all 3 members or at least 2 of the members have a theatrical background, it's like, oh yeah, 100%.
Totally. And I didn't know that at all until I got into this, and agreed. It made complete sense. Really, all 3 of them do, but mostly Victor and Gordon. So Gordon's parents were both in theater, and Victor worked as an actor. He was hired by Theater X because Willem Dafoe had been in the company and left to pursue fame and fortune, which he found. And Victor was hired to replace him. And so it's not just that they had like theatrical interest. There was real like sophisticated theatricality built into their artistic sensibility. And so I think part of that was worked into their instrumental presentation, wanting it to be unusual. And this isn't in the book, but maybe one of their first gigs, they got 3 women who were actresses when they were introduced as the Violent Femmes on stage. They had the women come out and sit down because they were the Femmes. And then people were like, who is this? And then the guys came out and like kicked it. It was like all the theater thing.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, once I heard that, it did make sense. It really did. It also speaks to their like, there's a real interesting sophistication to, their approach to what could in other settings be a real traditional pop songs,
Yeah. Well, we're kind of wrapping it up. I have one sort of final thought that kind of ties in a little bit to your epilogue, in which you talk about doing your homework just in time before you meet up with the band. And the bigger question is, has the band read the book and what do they think? But also, did you get any feedback about the story? Okay.
No, not yet. Yeah, no. So I've shared the book with the band. I've heard from management. They've been super supportive. I haven't heard from the guys. Victor was like, congrats, and I got messages from, management from the band like, this is great. But yeah, I haven't, they have not read the book. They have not said, one, they haven't said like, you got it all wrong. 2, they haven't said like, this is amazing. You got it right, Nick. Like, this is what we've been waiting for. So like, for me, writing this book was unusual because, so this is my 5th book, but it's my first one that's really not about me,
Sure.
The first 3 were novels. The 4th book was a memoir. And so for me, it was really interesting because I was very aware of the fact I was telling somebody else's story. And it really stressed me out. Like I really wanted to get it right. I didn't want to present anybody's story in the wrong way factually, or to tell it in a way that wasn't true to the way they didn't want it to be told. So I really trust the product. I don't think they're gonna, I don't think the band's gonna like read this book and be like, oh, Nick, we're gonna have to kill him. There's nothing weird in here, right?
No, certainly not.
At the same time though, like, yes, this is the first book about the album, but like, a million pages have been written about the Violent Femmes since this album came out. They don't need to read this book. They lived the book, It's like the parts where they're telling their stories, they already know those stories. And like the short memoir parts about me, they're like, okay, great, good job, Nick. Like, we don't care about, so
right.
In a way, I'm like, man, they don't even need to read the book as long as they feel like, that they trust it. That's what's important to me, is that I didn't get anything wrong, and that it also, like, this was a labor of love for me. I'm not trying to like do anything other than sort of talk about all the things in this album that I loved and that so many of us, love. So it's a love letter to the record.
That really comes across.
Cool.
I tend to have folks on the podcast that I want to talk to because I like the work. But this is truly one of my favorite 33 1/3 books. Like,
Thank you, man.
This really nails it, and I really hope that people get into it, because it's really one of the good ones. And I think for the reasons that you're saying, like, it feels like you really cared about getting the album right, about telling the story right. So I really hope folks check it out. We will have it stocked at SKYLIT Books in the Arts Annex. What's the release date on the book again?
May 14th.
Okay, cool. We're going to put this out, I think, May 7th, so there's a little bit of pre-order time. Pre-order it. Come on by. Pick up a copy. It's going to be great. Anything you want to plug at the end here, Nick?
I'll be doing a book tour that starts in May, and will continue throughout the year. There's a week or two that's already booked, but if I make it out to LA, I'll let you know.
Excellent.
Yes, but thank you for having me. I hope we get to hang in person sometime.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the SKYLIT Books podcast series. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to check out the book featured in this episode, or others, please visit skylitbooks.com. If you're in the Los Angeles area, stop by for one of our live in-person author events. You can find a calendar on our website. If you like this podcast, leave us a review. It really helps us out. Our music is by Duck the Piano Wire. Till next time.